Good morning, everybody. Hello. My name is Dennis Rivard. I know this is New Orleans, and with a laissez-faire attitude, even with my highest laissez-faire attitude, I could not be Tina. So I thank you for dealing with me. Stop laughing, Ari. So today I'm going to talk about reimbursement for acute MCS, CPS, and percutaneous use of the devices. And before I get started, I'm not going to be discussing any off-label products for the St. Jude organization, and the opinions and thoughts expressed from the podium today reflect my opinions and not the company of St. Jude Medical, who and how I work for, and so therefore our lawyers are now happy. So I want to talk a little bit about acute MCS and ECMO, ECLS programs, and we do a lot of work with individual centers on helping them become financially viable and making sure that they're getting the money that they truly deserve based on their clinical processes. And we found that in our work that most programs, when they do the correct coding and documentation, actually are quite financially viable for these lines. It comes down to basically focusing on understanding the indications, how you're documenting your notes, making sure that the coding is accurate. And I always love the fact that the good patient selection with a low length of stay, but most of the topics we're going to talk about ECMO usually are not low lengths of stays. And also, every manufacturer has some type of reimbursement on their website, so I would encourage you to whatever product you're using, if you want some more information on reimbursement specific for that product, to go online to the manufacturer's websites. And when in doubt, you should probably get to know your hospital coders and the billers for the charges and financial services team to confirm payment. Most hospitals now have what's called nurse navigators and the documentation navigators, and their sole job is to track documentation and make sure that the language in which the coders can appropriately pick the code to charge is written in the note. So a lot of times, somebody may write that patients on dialysis, but from a coder's perspective, they're looking for renal failure. And so there may be a misdiagnosed, miscode, only because of the language that you and I understand, but a lot of times the coders do not. So let's talk about inpatient first. So as a perfusionist, I pretty much had no concept of what reimbursement was like. And when I joined initially Thortec before we became St. Jude, it was pretty much still Greek to me. And I was fascinated by the process, so I thought I'd take a couple minutes to sort of go through how that process works, why it's important. And the first thing you have to make sure that the reason you're using the device, that there's an approved indication for it. And once that improved indication for it has been verified, then you go through the process of documenting and assigning a code. So the ICD10 codes are assigned, and it's based on the clinical documentation by the clinical coding specialist to review the notes of the chart. And they put this ICD10 code, which they determine is the one that you would use for the particular procedure, and it tracks through a computer system to what's called the DRG. This is speaking specifically for Medicare. For the DRG is a diagnostic-related group, and that's how the government pays you for your product. And I'm sorry, I'm 55 years old, I need my glasses. All right, here we go. Look at me, we've got slides. So a DRG actually is different for each hospital. It's set based on a base payment, which is set by the government, which changes every year. But also, the government looks at whether the hospital is an academic center or not, and will give a little additional payment if it's a teaching hospital, because the government subsidizes resident teaching programs. Also, the cost of the demographic area. If you have your community hospital in the middle of the United States versus a large hospital in Manhattan, the demographic costs are different, and so they take that into effect. And then once that is determined, they also what's called a dish payment, and they look at the potential indigent population that the hospital is going to serve, that they're never going to get paid for, and so they add into that. And from that, you get your DRG payment. And so for two hospitals to do the same procedure in the same city, one's an academic, one's not, will get different payments based on all that information. So what's an ICD-10? So last year, after many years of threatening, the government finally initiated and launched their ICD-10 codes. And they are codes that define what you have done. And I sort of broken it down for you. So the typical code, 02HL3D, what exactly does that mean? And so basically the 0 means that it was a medical and surgical grouping. The 2 means that the procedure involved the heart and the great vessels. The H means it actually involved an insertion into the heart or the great vessels. The L means it went to the left ventricle. 3, it was percutaneous. And D, an intraluminal device was introduced. So from all that, they determined that that's the code. So the coders would have to see some of this information all in there to assign the correct code. So we talked about indications a second ago. So I want to talk about acute MCS therapy, and there are only 2 approved indications in the government that will pay for the device and the procedure. One is a post-cardiotomy, which is a bridge to recovery, and the other one is a bridge to bridge. So post-cardiotomy, that's when the device is intended to be for short-term use to support a condition that's anticipated to be reversible, putting them on a centromag after unable to come off bypass, going to try to recover the heart. Or a bridge to a bridge. That's when the device is for short-term use, most of the time put in an emergency situation, until a decision can be made on when a permanent device can be implanted. So both post-cardiotomy and both bridge to bridge are covered by Medicare and most private payers. The Medicaids, it truly depends on the state you live in. Some are better than others, but every state is different and the state regulates the Medicaid dollars. Placing an acute device as a documented bridge to transplant or as destination therapy is not considered a covered entity. So it's very important that when you're writing your notes, you make sure that you know what the coverage should be and what the exact indication of the device is. Counterpoint support for short-term devices is approved for 6 hours. And but the payment is actually based on how the procedure itself is put in, not the indication. So the indication means that it's covered. And then the payment is based on the ICD10 codes. Here's an example of an ICD10 codes and how things map. So the ICD10 code for a cardiac output using other pump, intermittent or continuous, meaning it's a pulsatile and non-pulsatile, continuous flow, are either going to be tracked to 5A02116 or 5A02216. And what both of those will go to, they track to what's called DRG 215. And the average base payment, that's before they put in the academic, the dish payment and the geography payment, is $93,731. So what if the patient got like 15 or 16 different procedures? What if they ended up getting a heart transplant, for example? The coders put all this information in, and then the coding machine actually determines what is the highest payment DRG, because that's what the hospital deserves. So for example, if a patient goes on to an assist device like this, and it's going to be tracking to this code, but ultimately in the same admission gets a heart transplant, that tracks to DRG1, which is the highest paying DRG. So the hospital will get paid 1 DRG, and it's going to be the highest paying DRG based on the track record. A little bit ECMO. This is right from the CMS website on what the covered entities for ECMO and ECLS therapy. It needs to be reasonable and medically necessary. So it's the responsibility of the clinician to demonstrate to the Medicare folks that this process and this procedure and the support was reasonable and medically necessary. So I'm not going to take the time to read through all this whole slide, but you have the list of the criteria that have to be documented. And it's important that the documentation supports the medical necessity for the system. So ECLS, for example, for ECMO, it's going to be 5A15223, and that actually tracks to DRG 003, which a base payment of $104,259. So if the patient got a short-term device and ended up going on ECMO, he's putting an oxygenator in it to go back, the 215 pays $93,751. 003 pays 104. So in this particular situation, the hospital will get paid the DRG3. Then it gets confusing. There are over 400 codes, 400 DRGs, so there's a lot of DRGs. So this is an example of what happens all the times in the cath lab, for example. You can have your ICD10 codes will track to your left, and they will track to one of these MSDRG payments of 216 all the way up to 221. And the payments associated with them are next. And you notice there's quite a range of payments on those, and that's because if you look at the definitions of these DRGs, when the 216, which is the highest one, is a cardiac valve or other major cardiothoracic procedure with a cardiac cath with MCCs. MCCs stands for major comorbidity complications. So that's the patient that had a lot of complications associated with it. And there are specific list of what tracks and triggers a major complication. 217 paid a little less. It's still a cardiac cath, a cardiothoracic procedure with cardiac cath with complications. They're not major, but they're considered complications. And then there's the 218, which is the cardiac valve or other major cardiovascular procedure with cardiac cath without any complications. So the payment goes down. And then the last three, the 219, 220, and 221, are all based on what they're given with major complications, or without having actually a cardiac catheterization. So to go back up to here, you can see the more severe, the sicker patient with the major complications is going to be paid 216, which would be 64,580 as a base payment, versus the non-cath, no complications, 221, which would be 26,924. So a misdocumentation in this example, not putting in that it had major complications or not writing down the proper major complications, could be a difference of $30,000. The other thing we talk about, a lot of times as perfusionists, we'll put patients on, especially if you're at a community hospital and not a large academic hospital, even sometimes at large academic hospitals, we'll put patients on devices to be transferred to another hospital. So the government understands that this happens, and understands it happens for a reason, and it's what's best for the patient. But the hospital doesn't want to pay two people the same thing, or two centers the same thing. So what they've done is for a lot of the DRGs, they're all prorated. They expect when a patient tracks to a DRG that they're going to be in the hospital for at least so many days. And so if that patient isn't in that hospital for those so many days and gets transferred out to another hospital, they decided that, you know what, we're not going to pay that first hospital the entire DRG because the patient really wasn't there for that entire time, but got transferred to another facility. So then they don't want to pay your facility and the other facility the DRG, so they're going to prorate or cut your payment on that. Now the other center starts fresh. So if you are the admitting center of this device-bearing patient, you'll start from scratch, and whatever processes you do, whether they get transplants or VAD or whatever it may be, that's a totally separate payment schedule altogether. But how exactly do they determine what's fair on the payment? And they decided that, for example, the example I used here, payments are for acute MCS, the payments divided into what's called 11 units. Okay, so they break the total payment down to units. And they always give day one 2 unit values because they've determined the first day of that implant or that support is probably the most expensive day because you're paying for the device. And the other days are maintenance. So for acute MCS, your payments get 11 units. Day 1 gets 2 units. The full DRG payment of $215 happens at day 10. For ECLS and ECMO, it's divided by that. They think that the ECMO run should be approximately 25 days for length of stay. So the first day, so they have 26 units, with the first day getting 2 units, and then the rest of the DRG payment going on to 25 days. So percutaneous, the cath lab ones we were talking about basically are split down here, the 216 to 221, the number of units, and they break it the same exact way, two units the first day, and 1 other unit for the other days. So again, the hospital that is receiving the patient starts a whole new DRG process from that documentation. So, you know, as morbid as it may sound, death pays. And so if the patient, for example, you put a device in, unfortunately did not make it, you still get the full DRG payment, even if the length of stay was 2 days. But if you transfer that patient out at 2 days to another hospital, you get a prorated payment. So why is that important? It's a lot of times you need to consider You know, if you're the transferring hospital, their finances are going to be involved. How many days to keep that needs to be taken into effect when determining payment, but should absolutely not affect the way you treat the patient. The other thing I wanted to talk briefly about is those expensive patients. And we see a lot of expensive patients in the fields that we're all in. And so what happens if your DRG payment one is $250,000? It's the transplant and or VAD DRG by just $250,000. But your patient ends up costing you about $1 million. Okay, so we all have those patients where they're in the hospital for a long time, a lot of complications, always a sad situation. What happens to those patients? Does the hospital have to eat that $750,000? And no, it doesn't, because the government recognized also that there is some opportunity and there's going to be some patient population that we deal with that are just going to be these tough cases. And so what happens is they hit what's called an outlier category. And an outlier category basically is determined by the government. And when they look at the cost, about how much it would cost and how much more it costs the hospital than the DRG payment that it tracks to. And when that value has hit that specific number, it's called now, that becomes what's called an outlier. So outliers basically are patient-specific, and they vary from hospital to hospital based on what's called the cost-to-charge ratio. So every hospital charges more than the cost of the device because there are going to be some patients they're not going to get any money from, and so at the end of the day, they've got to keep the lights on and pay the mortgage. And so what they do is they increase the charge, recognizing they're probably not going to get the full payment. And the typical charge, upcharge, is 2.5 times the cost. And so this data is collected by the government, and they create what's called a cost-to-charge ratio. So when you're charging so much, I'm going to guess, based on what you've told me, what your actual costs are going to be. They don't know the exact number, but they're going to just figure that out. And when they have that information of what you charge and what they anticipate your costs actually are, they do what's called the cost-to-charge ratio. And it's looked over for the previous year to determine that it changes every year. So how does this work? So you have your inpatient charges, let's say it's $500,000. And for this particular hospital, the cost-to-charge ratio is 0.36. That means that Medicare thinks that of that $500,000, the hospital's cost is probably about $180,000, give or take. So, but the DRG payment for $215 for this hospital is only $145,000. So obviously, the cost is going to exceed the payment, so that triggers an outlier. But the government also says it's not going to be that easy. So we're going to go ahead and charge you a threshold for this hospital's, little about 25.8 on top of that, and say, what is the difference? We add those up. It's 170, which is the total payment plus your loss threshold of 170. So the difference between this number and this number is going to be actually what your cost over DRG threshold is going to be. The government will then pay 80% of that number for 7,361. So instead of the 145, because this patient hit an outlier, you're going to get 152. Why is that important? Because some folks, Medicare is going to only pay a certain amount of money, so why am I documenting all this stuff? I'm not going to document every syringe I use. I'm just not going to document that because it's a loss anyway, and that's not actually true. You need to be appropriate with your charges to make sure all your charges are in. And in the event that when they work through this process, this particular patient reaches an outlier, there will be an additional payment that the government will give. Now, will your hospital be able to build a wing specifically for perfusion and you all get offices with windows based on outlier payments? No, it's not. But every little penny counts, and so it's important that when the patient in the hospital deserves an outlier charge, that they get it. So how do you get this information, and how do you get involved with the process? The first I would say is to find out if your hospital has a documentation specialist, and if they do they understand what you do? Do they understand what you process in the OR for ECMO or CPS or acute, whatever it may be, ECLS, whatever it may be? Do they understand the language that you use? Are you using language that they understand? Because these people are the ones actually that is the tie between your clinical note and the coders, which is going to result in the hospital being paid. So find out if you have a conversation with them. I know when I was a VAD coordinator, that was something that was becoming incredibly valuable, because when I met with our coders, they had absolutely no idea what a VAD was. But I met with our documentation specialists, and they had a totally, VAD was vascular access device. And I'm like, no, it's a ventricular assist device, and it's much more expensive. And so it wouldn't be bad necessarily to have those conversations with the folks to make sure that you understand, you're all speaking the same language, so the hospital gets the payment that it truly deserves. The other thing to do is to get a chief's report, or a building as a service line. So you need to know where you actually stand financially. So if you request data for analysis of all your MCS implants, or whatever it may be, acute or chronic, you need the patient identifier, admission charge, discharge date, total length of stay. What was the MSG? Where did it track to? Where did it track to? And a lot of centers that are tracking this carefully, and your cardiovascular line should be one of them, they can actually flag when certain procedures track to a certain DRG. An example would be, in our analysis of reviewing of Medicare claims by hospitals for ventricular assist devices, we found that 95% of all of the claims should track to DRG1, which is the highest paying DRG. But you look at the MedPAR data, which is the data that is supplied by Medicare, Medicare actually pays out only 80% to DRG1 and 20% to DRG2, which is a lesser payment. So from our analysis, 15% of the DRG2 payment should actually be DRG1 patients. And when you talk about that level of DRG, it's a significant amount of money. So it's important to know what it tracked to. You need to know what the discharge of the patient, was the patient discharged, when the implant. All of that comes into your effects, which actually gets your net bottom line, which is available to you through getting a service line. So what do you get out of it? Well, you get the report. It's usually monthly. You can review it with the financial folks within the hospital. You can work with your nurse navigator for documentation. And questions to ask: if you're a contract group, are you getting your contracted amount? How does that work into the process? Does the payment to the hospital is getting lower than what you anticipate it should be? And are they actually getting some denials in which you can work with? And is the payer taking a long time to pay? It's important, especially if you are working on a payment system specifically of your own cost center, that you are aware of these charges and these payments. Real quickly, I want to talk about professional coding. This is the physician coding. I'm not going to go into detail here too much, but basically the physicians also get paid as what's called CPT codes for the processes that they do. And here are some of the typical ones for short acute devices, where there's insertion of and they go into whether it's external, internal, whether one ventricle, two ventricles, and that also is determined by the documentation, and you can see the different payments that are there. So how do they determine what those payments are going to be? They get those payments actually by the physician's information that they do. And what I wanted to show you is the difference. There's a lot of stuff up here, but it always kicks me. They do a non-facility and a facility payment, and this is for ECMO. So God love you if you're putting patients on ECMO outside the hospital. I want to hear about it. And this, if you go into an ER and you're putting a patient, that's in a hospital. We're talking physician clinic type thing. So if you are, there are the payments that were there. That was last year. And this year, they've broken them down. But if you notice, the payments are less. Why would a physician payment go down? That doesn't make much sense because their costs are going up. If the RVUs or the units of work that it takes to do the case actually lessens or becomes easier, then the payment goes down. For example, if you're doing a sternotomy, now you go to a thoracotomy, where there's less work involved, the thoracotomy is going to get a lower RVU value than a sternotomy. So that's how physician payments work. It's more. So, start to wrap things up. Let's look at some real-world financial viability. So, we looked at the data from 2010 until 2014 on acute MCS cases that hospitals allowed us. So hospitals will send us their bills. They're totally de-identified. There's no HIPAA information involved. We know nothing about the patient with the except of the charges that were put in. We analyzed the data for acute MCS, a total of 12 different hospitals that we utilized. Now, a lot of times, and claims that were incorrect assignments due to coding errors we were discards. A lot of times we can say, you know, that was you need to go back and recode this because this actually got sent to the wrong DRG. And then we used all the results to calculate the median. And what we showed, actually, is that revenues greater than $46,000 were, the payment was $46,000 above what the costs were for that particular procedure. So we saw an average of those 12 hospitals, $168,721 payment, as opposed to the cost of $122,450. And of course, the commercial payers always pay better than the government payers, so they're trying to make that more lateral across the board. They still do. So what does that mean? You can see here, looking at our data, so here's the top is the total, the 13,852. And these are just cities. There are hospitals in the city. We de-identified the hospital and just put the city. But if you notice, for the same procedures and the same practices, depending on how their documentation, potentially, and how they track, that some hospitals actually ended up making some nice money, while their other hospitals lost for the same procedure. Now, there is the difference in DRG payments and such, but a lot of this goes to just proper documentation and proper tracking. So in summary, I think we all have a responsibility to help our hospitals and our documentation specialists and our coders understand what we do, what the processes are, and how to know their language, and so know what their triggers are, so we make sure that if we have a patient that has a major complication, that we're writing it down appropriately so that the coders pick up that major complication and track correctly. You could try to get a service line report to make sure that you're financially viable. And again, reimbursement manufacturers' websites are there for you. And with that, I'm complete. Thank you.